The thing about rock bottom is that you never see it coming until you're already there. 5 years after Karen's death, I was still living in our old apartment, surrounded by her things, trapped in a cocoon of memories and regrets. The bills piled up like autumn leaves, and my savings account had long since dwindled to double digits. At 48, starting over felt like trying to climb a mountain with broken legs. Every night, I'd sit in her favorite armchair, staring at the worn fabric where her fingers used to drum against the armrest when she was deep in thought. The silence was the worst part. Our apartment used to be filled with her laugh, the gentle click-clack of her knitting needles, the soft humming as she cooked. Now there was just the hollow echo of my own breathing and the distant sounds of city life filtering through thin walls. That's why the job posting caught my eye. Night watchman at First Hope Apothecary. $20 an hour. The ad promised minimal duties, perfect for someone who preferred solitude. Someone like me. I should have known better. When something seems too good to be true, it usually is. But desperation has a way of clouding judgment, of making red flags look like welcome banners. I remember pulling up to the pharmacy that first evening, the October wind whistling through the narrow streets of Old Boston. The building stood like a relic from another century, its faded brick exterior wearing shadows like a cloak. The gold lettering on the sign, First Hope Apothecary, was chipped and tarnished, barely visible in the dying light. Something about it made my skin prickle, like walking past a cemetery at dusk. That should have been my first warning. The manager, Carl, was waiting by the entrance. He was a thin man with sunken eyes that seemed to dart everywhere except my face. His hands never stopped moving, fingers twitching and intertwining like nervous spiders. Looking back, I wonder if he knew what he was sending me into, if his conscience ever kept him awake at night. "You must be George," he said, his voice tight and strained. "Thanks for coming on such short notice. The last guy, he had to leave suddenly." I nodded, trying to ignore the way his eye twitched when he mentioned his previous employee. "Happy to help. Seems like a straightforward job." Carl's laugh was hollow, like wind through dead leaves. "Yeah, straightforward. Just remember to lock up at 11:57 sharp. Not 11:56, not 11:58. Exactly 11:57. He handed me a set of brass keys that felt unnaturally cold against my palm. "And stay in the front area unless there's an emergency. The supply room, well, just avoid it if you can." Before I could ask why the specific time mattered, or what was wrong with the supply room, he clapped me on the shoulder and hurried away. His footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, quick and uneven, like he couldn't get away fast enough. Standing alone in the entrance, I felt the weight of the building's silence press against my ears. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood and something medicinal, sharp and slightly sweet. Glass jars lined the wooden shelves, their contents casting strange shadows in the dim light. Some held powders in various shades of gray and brown. Others contained dried herbs or things I couldn't identify. The labels were written in faded script, the kind you might find in an antique medical textbook. I didn't know it then, but that moment, standing in the doorway with those cold keys in my hand, was my last chance to walk away, to return to my empty apartment and my familiar grief. Instead, I stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind me, the bell's gentle chime sealing my fate like the closing of a tomb. The first walk-through felt like exploring a museum after hours. Each footstep creaked against the ancient floorboards, the sound swallowed by rows of dusty shelves. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their pale glow doing little to dispel the shadows that pooled in the corners. The old cash register squatted on the counter like a brass gargoyle, its keys worn smooth by decades of use. But it was the supply room that made my skin crawl. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment I pushed open that heavy wooden door. Unlike the organized chaos of the main store, the supply room was clinically sterile, with steel cabinets lining the walls like silent sentinels. Their surfaces reflected the flickering fluorescent light, creating strange patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air carried a sharp, antiseptic smell that barely masked something else, something rotten and sweet, like decaying flowers. Looking for the first aid kit seemed like a reasonable first task. Better to know where everything was in case of an emergency. I found it on a shelf near the back, an old metal box covered in a layer of dust so thick it came away in sheets under my fingers. The hinges protested as I opened it, letting out a sound like a distant scream. Instead of the expected bandages and antiseptic wipes, I found strips of yellowed gauze covered in cramped handwriting. The ink was brown, at least I hoped it was ink, and had faded in places, but the words were still legible. My hands shook as I carefully unfolded the first strip. "Rules to survive the night," it read. The handwriting was frantic, uneven, like someone had written it in a hurry, or in fear. The list that followed made my stomach turn. Rule 1. Always lock the front door exactly at 11:57 p.m. and never unlock it until sunrise. Rule 2. If you hear knocking from the cabinets, do not open them under any circumstances. Rule 3. Leave an unopened bottle of rubbing alcohol on the back counter before midnight. Rule 4. Never touch the old mortar and pestle in the display case. Rule 5. If the lights flicker twice in a row, stand completely still until they stabilize. Rule 6. Do not answer the landline phone if it rings after 1:03 a.m. Rule 7. Always clean the glass medicine display before leaving, but never touch the jars with the red labels. I stared at the list, my mind trying to rationalize what I was reading. It had to be a prank, right? Some elaborate joke played by former employees to scare the new guy. But something about the desperate scrawl, the way the letters sometimes shook and ran together, suggested otherwise. This wasn't written for fun. This was written by someone who needed others to survive. A sudden bang from one of the cabinets made me jump, the first aid kit clattering to the floor. The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off the metal surfaces until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, silence, but not the natural quiet of an empty room. This silence felt alive, expectant, like the pause between a lightning flash and its thunder. I quickly shoved the bandages back into the kit and returned it to its shelf, trying to ignore how my hands trembled. The rules kept repeating in my head, a litany of warnings that seemed more ominous with each passing second. Part of me wanted to walk out right then, to hell with the job and the money. But I thought of my empty apartment, of the past due notices piling up on my kitchen table, of Karen's medical bills that I was still paying off. Besides, they were just words on some old bandages, probably left by some bored employee years ago. Nothing to be afraid of. God, I wish I'd been right. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m., 12 minutes until I had to lock the front door. Exactly at 11:57, according to the rules. As I walked back to the main area, I could have sworn I heard something moving inside one of the cabinets. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails against metal. I didn't look back. Some part of me knew that if I did, I might see something that would make me run screaming into the night. And I couldn't afford to lose this job. Not yet, anyway. The minutes leading up to 11:57 felt like hours. I stood by the front door, brass key in hand, watching the ancient clock on the wall tick away the seconds. Each click of its hands seemed to echo through the empty pharmacy, mixing with the low hum of fluorescent lights and my own shallow breathing. My mind kept drifting back to Karen. She would have laughed at my nervousness, told me I was being silly about a bunch of old bandages with crazy rules written on them. But Karen wasn't here. She'd never be here again. Sometimes I wondered if that's why I took this job, not just for the money, but because the emptiness of the pharmacy matched the hollowness inside me. 11:56. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin like a cold, wet blanket. The smell of old medicine and dust took on a metallic edge, sharp enough to make my eyes water. From somewhere in the back of the store came a sound like glass grinding against glass, so faint I might have imagined it. 11:56:30. My palms were sweating now, making the key slippery in my grasp. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, the shadows between the shelves deeper and more animate. I could have sworn I saw movement in them, like dark figures sliding between the aisles. 11:56:45. The grinding sound grew louder, distinct now, unmistakable, like someone was dragging something heavy across a glass surface. My heart hammered against my ribs as I remembered the rule about the medicine display. Had I touched something I shouldn't have? 11:56:50. The temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face. The key felt like ice in my hand, so cold it burned. 11:56:55. The shadows were definitely moving now, coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. My hands shook as I lifted the key to the lock. 11:57. I turned the key exactly as the second hand hit 12. The lock clicked into place with a sound like breaking bone. The grinding noise stopped instantly. The shadows retreated to their corners. The temperature began to rise. But something had changed in the pharmacy. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was expectant, like a held breath. And then I heard it. A soft thud from deep within the store, followed by another and another. Like footsteps, but too heavy, too irregular. They were coming from the direction of the supply room. I gripped my flashlight tighter, its beam weak against the growing darkness between the shelves. The rules hadn't said anything about investigating strange noises, but I was the night watchman. It was my job to check, wasn't it? The thuds grew louder as I approached the supply room. The air got colder with each step, until I was shivering despite my jacket. The medicinal smell was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something that reminded me of the hospital where Karen spent her last days. The supply room door was closed, just as I'd left it. But there was something wrong with the shadows around it. They seemed to pulse and writhe, like living things trying to break free from the walls. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was so cold it nearly stuck to my skin. I pushed the door open. The supply room was exactly as I'd left it, every cabinet closed, every shelf untouched. But there, on the back counter, sat a bottle of rubbing alcohol, full, unopened. The label gleamed under the flickering fluorescent light. I hadn't put it there. The third rule echoed in my mind. Leave an unopened bottle of rubbing alcohol on the back counter before midnight. I checked my watch. 11:59. As I stared at the bottle, trying to make sense of its appearance, a new sound filled the air. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from inside one of the cabinets, like knuckles against metal. If you hear knocking from the cabinets, do not open them under any circumstances. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then another cabinet joined in, and another. Soon the whole room was filled with a symphony of knocking, each cabinet contributing its own desperate rhythm. I backed away slowly, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Just before I slammed the door shut, I caught a glimpse of one of the cabinet doors beginning to vibrate, its hinges squealing in protest. I didn't stop running until I reached the front counter, where I collapsed into the ancient wooden chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The knocking was muffled now, but still audible, a constant reminder that something was in there, waiting. The clock struck midnight, and somewhere in the building, a child began to cry. The child's cry echoed through the pharmacy, bouncing off the glass jars until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It wasn't a normal cry. It had a hollow quality to it, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The sound reminded me of Karen's last days in the hospital, when the morphine wasn't enough anymore. The same raw edge of pain, the same desperate plea for help. I gripped the edges of the wooden chair, my knuckles white. There shouldn't be any children here. The pharmacy was locked. I had checked every corner during my walkthrough. Yet the crying continued, sometimes fading to a whimper, sometimes rising to a heart-wrenching sob. 1 a.m. crept closer on the ancient clock, each tick seeming to take an eternity. The crying had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of bare feet padding across the wooden floor. Soft, irregular steps that never seemed to get closer or farther away. The fluorescent lights chose that moment to flicker. Once. Twice. If the lights flicker twice in a row, stand completely still until they stabilize. I froze mid-breath, remembering the rule. The footsteps stopped too, and in the sudden silence, I could hear something else. A wet, sliding sound, like something damp being dragged across the floor. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, my other senses became painfully sharp. The medicinal smell had grown stronger, but underneath it was something else. The unmistakable copper tang of blood. The air felt thick, almost liquid, pressing against my skin like cold hands. The sliding sound grew closer. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything except stand there in the darkness. But the rule echoed in my head, holding me in place like an invisible straitjacket. Something brushed against my leg. It was soft, almost gentle, like fingers testing the texture of fabric. But these weren't human fingers. They were too cold, too smooth, leaving trails of moisture on my pants. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, fighting the urge to move. In the darkness, I could hear breathing that wasn't my own. It came from somewhere above me, ragged and wet, like someone drowning. The lights flickered back on. The aisle was empty, but my pants leg was wet, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. It smelled like rubbing alcohol and something else, something that made my stomach turn. I barely made it to the waste bin before losing my dinner. The landline phone rang. The harsh mechanical trill cut through my nausea like a knife. I fumbled for my watch with shaking hands. 1:02 a.m. Do not answer the landline phone if it rings after 1:03 a.m. The ringing continued, shrill and demanding. Each ring seemed to make the shadows in the corners pulse and grow. I watched the seconds tick by on my watch, my heart pounding in sync with the phone's cry. 1:03 a.m. The ringing stopped mid-trill, like someone had cut the power. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. Then the phone rang again. This wasn't like before. This ring was deep, distorted, more like a moan than a mechanical sound. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Each ring lasted several seconds, the sound rising and falling like a dying animal's last breath. Something moved in my peripheral vision. One of the shadows had detached itself from the wall, taking on a vaguely human shape. It stood by the phone, its edges rippling like smoke in water. "Please," a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell if it came from the phone or the shadow. "Please help us." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice somehow bypassed them, appearing directly in my mind. "We just wanted to be cured." The voice continued, now joined by others, a chorus of pleading whispers. "The doctor said he could help us." The shadow stretched toward the phone, its arm impossibly long and thin. Where its hand should have been, there was only a twisted mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Join us," the voices said in unison. "Answer the phone. Make it stop. Make the pain stop." I squeezed my eyes shut and started counting. Karen had taught me this trick during my panic attacks after her diagnosis. Count to 10. Focus on the numbers. Nothing else exists. 1. The ringing grew louder. 2. More shadows peeled away from the walls. 3. The voices became a deafening chorus. 4. Something cold touched my shoulder. 5. The smell of blood and medicine was overwhelming. By the time I reached 10, the ringing had stopped. When I opened my eyes, the shadows had retreated, leaving only the normal darkness of the store's corners. But the air still felt wrong, like the whole building was holding its breath, waiting. I looked at my watch again. 1:15 a.m. Only 5 hours and 45 minutes until sunrise. I could make it. I had to make it. Then I heard the cabinet doors in the supply room burst open, all at once, like a gunshot in the silence. The sound of the cabinet doors slamming open sent me stumbling backward into the glass medicine display. My elbow hit the glass hard, and I heard something tip over inside. The sound of glass rolling against glass seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. Looking back, that was the moment everything went wrong. That simple accident, that one moment of clumsiness, broke the most important rule. Never touch the jars with the red labels. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. One of the red-labeled jars had tipped over, its contents seeping across the glass shelf. The liquid was thick and dark, more like oil than medicine, but it moved wrong, flowing upward against gravity, spreading in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost began to form on the glass display. The spilled liquid pulsed with a sickly green light, casting twisted shadows that writhed across the walls. "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically searching for something to clean up the spill. But as I watched, the liquid began to change. It grew darker, thicker, until it looked less like medicine and more like blood. Old blood, black and viscous. A low hum filled the air, starting just at the edge of hearing but growing steadily louder. It reminded me of the hospital machines that had kept Karen alive in her final days, but distorted, wrong. The sound seemed to vibrate in my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The shadows cast by the spilled liquid began to take shape. At first, they looked like smoke, but then they solidified into something worse. Faces. Dozens of them pressed against the walls like dark photographs, their features twisted in expressions of agony. Their mouths moved silently, but I could feel their words in my mind. "Help us. Save us. Free us." "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. "I didn't mean to..." The faces screamed. The sound was impossible. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a symphony of agony that shattered every glass jar in the display case. I collapsed to my knees, hands pressed against my ears, but the screaming was inside my head now. Through the cacophony, I began to see things, flashes of memory that weren't mine. A hospital ward, beds filled with dying patients, the smell of sickness and despair. A doctor in an old-fashioned coat, grinding herbs in a mortar and pestle, promising cures that never came. "We trusted him," the voices whispered. "We believed him when he said he could save us." But the medicine was wrong. The spilled liquid had spread across the floor now, forming a perfect circle around me. In its reflection, I saw faces I somehow recognized, the patients from those borrowed memories. Men, women, children, all of them sick, all of them desperate for the miracle cure the doctor had promised. He didn't tell us what was in the medicine, the voices continued. Didn't tell us the price we would pay, and when we died, when his experiments failed, he didn't let us go. The shadows peeled away from the walls, taking solid form. They moved like smoke, but looked almost human, their bodies emaciated, their eyes sunken and dark. They surrounded me, their cold hands reaching out. "You spilled the medicine," they said in unison. "You broke the seal. Now you must take our place." "What seal?" I gasped, scrambling backward until I hit the display case. "What do you mean?" "The red bottles contain more than medicine," they whispered. "They contain us, our pain, our suffering, our souls. And now..." I felt something wet and cold touch my ankle. The spilled liquid had reached me, soaking through my sock. The sensation was like ice, but it burned, a deep, consuming cold that spread up my leg like poison. "Now you'll understand," the voices said. "Now you'll become part of the pharmacy, part of us." The cold reached my chest, and with it came the pain, not just physical pain, but the accumulated agony of dozens of souls who had died in that forgotten hospital ward. I felt their fear, their desperation, their betrayal. I felt the burning of toxic medicines in their veins, the slow failure of their organs, the moment each of them realized they were going to die. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows pressed closer, their forms melting together into a wave of darkness that crashed over me like tar. As consciousness faded, I saw the doctor's face one last time. Not in memory, but there in the pharmacy, watching from behind the glass display with eyes that glowed like dying stars. The last thing I heard was his voice, echoing across decades of suffering. "The medicine must be preserved. The work must continue. And now, you'll help me." I woke up in a hospital ward, but not one from our time. The air was thick with the stench of decay and disinfectant, and the walls were stained with age-old water damage. Rows of iron beds stretched into the darkness, each one occupied by a writhing, moaning figure. This was the place from the visions, the hospital that had stood here before the pharmacy. But seeing it like this, living it, was infinitely worse than any memory. A nurse rushed past me, her white uniform stained with something dark. Her face was gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion and horror. "Doctor!" she called out, her voice trembling. "We're losing another one. The new medicine. It's making them worse." I tried to move, to speak, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in this moment, forced to witness what had happened here. The walls seemed to pulse with shadows, and in them, I saw faces I recognized from the pharmacy, the same tortured souls who had reached for me. The doctor appeared from the darkness, and my blood ran cold. He wore a long black coat, but it wasn't the coat that terrified me. It was his eyes. They held the same sickly green glow as the spilled liquid, burning with a fevered intensity that spoke of madness and obsession. "The medicine will work," he muttered, moving between the beds with quick, jerky movements. "It must work. They don't understand. Sacrifices must be made for progress." In his hands was the mortar and pestle from the display case, but now it was crusted with dark stains. As he ground whatever was inside, the patients began to scream. Their bodies contorted unnaturally, backs arching off the beds, skin turning gray and translucent. "Dr. Thaddeus," the nurse pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Stop this. They're suffering. This isn't medicine anymore, it's torture." He shook her off, his eyes blazing brighter. "Suffering is necessary for advancement. Their pain will save thousands, millions, and their spirits will fuel my work for eternity." The scene shifted, blurred, reformed. Now I saw him at night, alone in the ward, performing rituals over the dying. The mortar and pestle glowed with an unholy light as he mixed herbs with something darker, something that moved and whispered. With each death, the shadows grew stronger, and the doctor's eyes burned brighter. "Do you understand now?" The voices were back, surrounding me in the darkness. "He didn't just kill us. He bound us here. Our spirits, our pain, our very essence, trapped in his medicines for nearly a century. The hospital dissolved, and I was back in the pharmacy. But everything was different now. The walls were transparent, showing the hospital ward that still existed in some other dimension. The shelves of medicines glowed with trapped souls, each bottle a prison for countless tortured spirits. I tried to run, but my body felt wrong, light, insubstantial. When I looked down at my hands, I could see through them. "Welcome to our family," the voices whispered. "You spilled the medicine. You released some of us. But the price must be paid." That's when I saw my body, still lying by the display case. But it wasn't really my body anymore. The skin had turned gray and translucent, just like the patient's in the vision. And inside I could see shadows moving, writhing, making themselves at home. "Help!" I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard the doctor's laughter, echoing through decades of trapped time. "No one can help you now," his voice rasped. "You're part of my collection, part of my great work. Your spirit will fuel the medicines just like the others. And when the next night watchman comes..." I understood then. Understood why Carl had been so nervous, why he'd been so specific about the rules. He knew. He'd always known. How many others had he sent here, feeding the doctor's eternal experiment? The shadows swirled around me, through me, pulling me toward the red-labeled bottles. I tried to resist, but how do you fight something that's everywhere? Everything. "Don't fight it," the other spirits whispered. "It's easier if you don't fight. Just let go. Become part of the medicine. Part of us." As I felt myself dissolving, becoming one with the shadows and the spirits and the toxic medicines, my last thought was of Karen. At least now I understood her suffering. At least now I could share it with all the others trapped here, in this pharmacy that was never really a pharmacy at all. Morning came as it always did. Carl found the store exactly as it should be. Everything in its place, every jar intact, though one of the red-labeled bottles seemed a bit fuller than before. He sighed when he saw my body, gray and empty, slumped against the display case. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though whether to me or himself, I couldn't tell. "But the doctor, he must have his medicines. His work must continue." He was already pulling out his phone as he walked away, probably to post another job listing. Another night watchman needed, another soul for the doctor's collection. And from behind the glass, trapped in a bottle with a bright red label, I watched him go. Watched and waited, knowing that soon someone else would come. Someone else would break the rules. Someone else would join us in the doctor's eternal pharmacy, where the medicine never cures and the night shift never really ends.